Hi there, and welcome to the next video in the Azure Cloud series. Today we're going to look at recovery to Azure using NetBackup. My name is Loreno Galelli, and I'm the product manager for the Resiliency Platform. So before we get into the live demonstration, just want to highlight really what the architecture looks like. So we've got an on-premise data center running VMware. We've got a number of virtual machines which are running inside that environment. We have NetBackup primary and secondary servers on the on-premise site. They have backed up the virtual machines that we're going to be demonstrating with today. And the way in which the technology or the NetBackup solution works is the backups will be sent to blob storage inside the Azure region. And then what we're going to do in Azure, we're going to use something called a NetBackup Cloud Recovery Server, which will import the backup images. It will then, from those import, it will do a restore into a virtual machine that be residing on Azure inside the relevant network, which we can obviously demonstrate for the likes of rehearsals and also recovery as well. So this technology, the way in which it works is the virtual machines are stood up on a just-in-time provisioning aspect. So until you actually invoke a rehearsal or a recovery, that's when those machines are brought online, and obviously resources are consumed as well. Regards the infrastructure, we've got things like the resiliency managers across the various Azure region and also on-prem, along with the infrastructure management servers, which will be part of that discovery aspect as well. So let's get into the environment and just give you a brief view of what that looks like. Okay, so we're looking at the Resiliency Platform user interface. We've got a couple of sites which have been configured. Our on-prem is in India, and we're going to US West 1 on the Azure side for the various region itself. What I've done, I've configured a resiliency group, and if we look at that resiliency group in a bit more detail, what we'll see currently, the workloads are residing in India. They're using NetBackup for the data availability, so the backup images have been carried out, and we can see that if we look at the primary server, NetBackup server in India, we can see a couple of backups have occurred in relation to a number of workloads that we are protecting. We can see activities which are run, and we're going to run some activities during the demo. And then if we look at the copy image information, we can see that the various backups occurred. They occurred yesterday, as in October the 13th. And we have the images which are being I guess storage lifecycle policy into the cloud, into that object storage in the cloud itself. So we've got those there which are running. And in the cloud, we have that cloud recovery server. And this is where the import and recovery of those workloads will occur. And then Resiliency Platform, what that will do, it will wrap the orchestration around that recovery and then present those virtual machines in the relevant region that we are creating as well. So the first thing we're going to do is carry out a rehearsal just to ensure that the recovery aspect of these workloads would work, in relation to running in the cloud itself. But before we do that, have a quick look at the configuration on the networking side. And what we'll see is the IP addresses for the workloads, the IP address for on-prem, and this is the IP addresses inside Azure. So we saw the IP address of these workloads when we initially failed over. When we carry out a rehearsal, which we're going to do in a moment, we'll see the relevant IP addresses inside the subnet for the workloads as well. So what we'll quickly do is carry out a rehearsal just to view the progress really of this. So we're going to rehearse in Mountain View, which will effectively restore these workloads in a isolated network with the relevant IP addresses, which are going to be applied as well. So again, we just submit that. And this is the workflow which is going to be carried out for this process. So it's going to restore the those workloads in Azure and then basically connect them into an isolated subnet for the relevant starting of those workloads as well. So what we'll see if I switch back to the Azure console and just do a refresh on this. We've got our 4 running machines for the appliances, which we need obviously for the resiliency platform itself. And eventually what we'll see are those rehearsal VMs being started in here. So if we expand this, we'll see it's currently stopping any VMs which are running, just in case they are. And then after this point, it'll go through the restore process of these workloads in that isolated network. And now we're at a point where we're importing a cloud image and then we'll perform the restore after that. So if we switch to the cloud recovery server in Azure, we can see the import process has completed. And then the next step will be the restore operation for these workloads. So if I just hit refresh, we should see the restore jobs kick in here. And again, they'll go through the relevant process for restoration. So again, what I'll do is I'll just pause the video for the moment, and then we'll stop when it gets to the end, and we'll look to see the status of those VMs on the Azure console. The rehearsal operation has completed. We can see it's completed all its steps successfully. If we go back, we'll get a view of the successful activity for the rehearse operation. If we look at the machines which were started and created for the rehearsal, we can see there, both of those machines are now up and running. If we look at the configuration of that one of the machines, what we'll see is the networking has been assigned the correct IP address in relation to the rehearsal requirement as well. So this machine's now active and up and running. Okay, so what we'd normally do after this point, obviously checking to make sure the applications or workloads are working as they should, is we would normally clean down the environment ready for the next cycle of testing. So all we need to do really is carry out this cleanup rehearsal operation. And again, we can check whether or not we want to continue if there's any issues in the environment, just in case anything fails. We'll just submit that. And we'll briefly look at the workflow. And essentially what it's going to do is stop those virtual machines which have been created for the rehearsal. It will then delete any the relevant contents, I guess, of the virtual machines, such as the volumes, remove them from network, etc. as well. So effectively just wipe down what's been created for a rehearsal environment, again, ready for the next testing cycle that you may have. I'll let this run through, and then what we'll do is we'll look at the console once it's completed. The workflow for the cleanup rehearsal is completed. So what we can double check is the virtual machine instances in Azure. If I just refresh the page, the 2 workloads have gone, so they've been removed successfully. And if we go back to the resiliency group, we can see the activity was successful for the cleanup operation. So that really concludes the rehearsal aspect of validating the images, in the cloud before you actually migrate to the cloud for that workload. So what we're going to do now is carry out an actual recovery into Azure. So we'll click on the recover icon. The target is going to be to Azure. We're also going to confirm an outage, which effectively will shut down, if it can, obviously, the VM workloads which are residing on the on-premise location. We're going to use the latest image, which I've got. I've only got one image, which is currently backed up at the moment, but if you had multiple, you could obviously choose the relevant time of the various images which are available to you as well. Okay, so what we'll see is the workflow in relation to this recover operation. So what it's going to do is going to go through the process of stopping the virtual machines if it can obviously get to the on-prem location, which it can. The virtual machines will be stopped, unregistered, and then it will go through the restore aspect of those workloads into Azure. It will then continue by connecting those virtual machines to the relevant network. There'll be some pre-register and registering of the virtual machines into Azure, and then finally it will start the virtual machines, and any post-start operations will also occur as well. So we'll leave that going for the moment, and then we'll come back when the restore operation is commencing. Okay, so we're now at a point of the restore operation with inside NetBackup. If I expand this, you'll see what it's currently doing. So it's just ensuring that the virtual machines, or there's no pre-existing virtual machines in Azure. It's going to restore to that latest timestamp. So it's ensuring that if there's any workloads which are running, it would obviously shut those down or stop them, and then it will present new workloads based on the time image which we've selected for the restore operation. Okay, so we're now importing the cloud image ready for recovery in Azure. So if we look at the cloud recovery server, let me just do a refresh here. The import actually is completed already, so it's extremely quick on the import process. The next step that it's going to come to is going to be the actual restore of the image, which we can see now coming in for both the workloads. So the first one here we can see is the Linux system, I believe, and then there'll be a Windows system coming in for restore now. So we'll let this run. This takes a number of minutes. I think it's about 8 or 9 minutes or so for the restore operation. So we'll come back to this once this step completes. So both restore jobs have now completed. So we can switch back to the Resiliency Platform user interface. The next step that we're going through now is the connection of the VMs to the Azure network, along with the relevant other steps after that. If we look at the Azure virtual machine dashboard console, we can see the number of current working VMs that are residing in Azure. So we've got the likes of Resiliency Manager, Infrastructure Management Server, and also the Cloud Recovery Server. Those are currently running in there at the moment. So we should see those other workloads being recovered and connected obviously to the relevant network as well. So we'll come back to this portal shortly once the relevant steps have been carried out. Okay, so we're now at a point where the virtual machines are starting in Azure, so we can actually switch to the Azure console again. And there we go. So we can see the two workloads which are currently running or starting to be running in there. So we've got the Linux machine and also the Windows machine, along with the size that we selected during the edit process for the resiliency group as well. So we can quite easily get more details about this VM in relation to things such as the IP address. So the IP personalization has been applied in relation to the subnet that's been required for this particular Azure region as well. So it's got a final few steps to go through. Once this completes, we can then look at the status of the resiliency group. So the operation's finished. The virtual machines are now up and running inside Azure. It took about 21 minutes roughly for that process to occur. The majority of time was really around the restore operation. for those workloads themselves. So let's go back and look at the resiliency group. We can see it's online. The active data center is in Azure. We can see obviously the backup images again, and also the workloads, their current state, and also their type in relation to Azure VM type as well. So our workloads are running on Azure. If we want to fail back or recover back to on-prem, there's a couple of things that we need to do initially. So when we actually failed from on-prem into Azure, we declared an outage. So the first thing we need to do is just clear that outage so we can actually fail back to on-prem. If we look at the risk which has been raised, there should be the risk in relation to an outage that's been declared in relation to the resiliency group that we're protecting. So what we'll do very quickly is click on clear outage. We're going to clear the outage so we can actually fail back to the VMware on-prem environment. So we'll just let that run. And we can see the risk has been has gone basically. So what we can do now is do the recover operation, but now we'll do it in reverse. So if we click on recover, we're going back to the on-prem environment, and again we're going to confirm an outage in relation to Azure. So we're having that declaration to say we have an outage, which is the reason why we're going to go back to the on-prem environment. And again, choosing either latest or a time range, depending on obviously what you're looking to achieve, and then submit that. And effectively, what we're going to see is the reverse operation from on-prem into Azure. And this time we're going to go from Azure into on-prem. So it's going to go through the task of stopping the virtual machines. There'll be some post operations in relation to that stopping, unregister or deallocating those virtual machines, and then we'll go through the restore process on-prem, and then carry on by starting the virtual machines, IP address assignment, etc. as well, and then we should be back up and running in the on-prem environment. So we'll let this run. If I expand, we're currently stopping those VMs at the moment. And if we switch to the Azure console and just do a refresh, what we should eventually see are these VMs going into a stopping state or a deallocation state as well. So this takes a little while for this to run through. And we can see here the first one's currently stopped at the moment, and then if I refresh again, we'll probably see the second one. And there we can see the second virtual machine is now stopping or in a stop state. And then what we'll do is we'll wait for this to run through, get to the restore point, and then I can switch to the on-prem NetBackup environment. And then what we'll see there are the restore jobs kick in relation to recovery of these images back to on-prem as well. So what we'll do, we'll just pause here, and then I'll resume once we get to a recovery point. So currently at the restore workload step at the moment. So if we look at the NetBackup primary server on-prem, we can see the two restore jobs are currently active for the workloads that we're recovering back to on-prem. What we'll do now, we'll just wait for these to complete, and then what we should see after that is the active state for those VMs as they come online on the on-prem environment. So again, we'll come back to this process at the end. So the workflow has completed. It went through and obviously restored those VMs. We saw that in the NetBackup web UI. It's also modified the IP address in relation to its placement for on-prem, and then obviously started the virtual machines as well. So if we go back and look at the resiliency group, we can see the active data center is back to the on-prem environment in VMware. We can see the locality of the workloads are both VMware in relation to their type. We do have the risk on continuity again, which is raised, which will be around the outage, which we declared prior to failing back to on-prem. So what we need to do is clear the outage so then we can obviously go back to Azure at a later point. So again, we just clear the outage and then submit that. And we see the risk has been removed. So that really covers the video. We saw the process of recovering the virtual machines which were on-prem into Azure. We also failed back those virtual machines from Azure back to on-prem as well. So with that, this really concludes this video regarding recovery to Azure with NetBackup. Thank you again for your time, much appreciated. Hope you found this video informative.